Hi everyone, my name is Aude and I'm a researcher in political ecology. And I've worked with indigenous communities in the United States for the past 10 years, first supporting grassroots initiatives, and now working on native land research, enabling data aggregated at the reservation level, which is something that's really hard to do and to find in the United States. And this is meant to facilitate land use and reconstitute the picture of the entire land oppression of the United States from reservation era to now. And this is something that's enabled by modern technology like GIS. So we use a lot of GIS to aggregate and process data. And this is all data that's publicly available. So there's no issue of data anonymity or this type of thing. But more broadly than that, my work is really focusing on starting from the premise that there's no real regenerative shift happening without deconstructing the power dynamics that have constructed them. And these power dynamics are basically embedded in what I call the colonial division of knowledge, but which is very much the way that the Western world has constructed this one worldview, which is a term that's used by a lot of decolonial scholars. But the premise is that you cannot build a sustainable world without decolonizing the world. That's the premise. And on that, there's a lot of very serious issues that manifest, because it's not so much, it doesn't just become about environmental justice or social justice, but really it's about changing worldviews and opening up to alternative worldviews to create what some call, and a lot of decolonial scholars call, the Pluriverse, which is a world where many worlds can fit, which is not the world in which we live right now. So that's it in a nutshell.
So you say the pluriverse, yeah? Like
Yes.
universe of pluralities and multitudes. Yeah, can you say a little bit more about that actually?
Sure. So the pluriverse is a term that's used by many decolonial scholars, especially people like Arturo Escobar, and it's been used worldwide increasingly in the literature, because it's very telling of the aim, which really is about creating a world where many worlds fit, as I said, which means that indigenous worldviews and the diversity of indigenous worldviews is in danger. The reason why they're in danger is because we are functioning under a hegemonic model, which some call the Western development model, the capitalist mode of production, you name it. It has a core which is of colonial origin, and which relied on the extinction and the genocide of other peoples, the taking of other people's lands, and the forbidding of their worldviews. And so if you're able to understand that, which is very much easy to demonstrate just by using political economy, then you understand that the one worldview is not just threatening diversity, it is also threatening sustainability and regeneration, because it forbids, it keeps forbidding alternative worldviews and worldviews that are more relational in essence. And that is really what you find as a pattern in indigenous worldviews worldwide. which now we refer to as indigenous, but originally what it means is just non-Western, non-imperialist, etc., etc. You start realizing that that's the common thread that links all of these worldviews together. And if you go back enough in time and history, in every single place in the world, you find indigenous past. And you being from Wales and me being from Brittany, we know that very well. We just have to go further back in history to find these pre-colonial roots, but they're there too. So it's a thread that really links all places in the world, and it's been replaced by the one worldview, which puts usually white, capitalist, patriarchal, um, Christian-based models and ways of thinking and ways of living and ways of relating to the earth in dominion to other worldviews. And so other people can enter that worldview, even if they're from other places. So it's not limited to white people to embody that model in order to work right now. It's embodied by many non-Western countries and peoples, etc. But it's still following an hegemonic model and way of thinking. I don't know if that's clarifying.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I've felt that for a long time that, this model or dominant paradigm is almost trying to oversimplify everything into one, right? Like, oh, we should have one language, one God, monoculture of crops in one place, which makes everything more vulnerable. And yeah, I don't know if you felt that yourself as well, that people in our Western societies seem unable to hold kind of multitudes and complexity as well, because there's always that message that there should be just one quick fix answer for everything. And yeah, everything should be put in a box.
Yeah, I think this is very typical, but it's structural as well, because the theological premise of the one worldview is based on land grab, right, and land commodification and land privatization, and these are concepts that you do find in other places in the world, but in a myriad of diversities of land tenure systems, right? So this idea that the land tenure system on which we primarily rely, which is the system of private property, private land property, the idea that this is universal is wrong. It's historically wrong. And so once you start studying other land tenure systems, you realize that although they were not necessarily all collective, but there was a wide range of diversity of organizing land around livelihoods or livelihoods around land, vice versa. But so this idea on which we all rely, land privatization, is an idea. It's a culture, and it has become a cultural project, right? And so I don't remember where I'm going with this after
Well,
answering.
yeah, can you tell me about some of the other models of land use that you've encountered?
Yeah, so the ones that I know the best are the land base of the Lakota people, with whom I've worked for the past 10 years, specifically on the Pine Ridge and Chine River Indian reservations. And I don't know what your knowledge is of these systems, but they've been actively colonized, so land taken as a beginning, and then they've been forcibly commodified and privatized, which was not so you have land that's been taken, and then people who have been put on remaining pieces of land where they didn't have a choice to go in the first place. And then after that, although these treaties were signed between supposedly sovereign nations, so this made them international treaties, the fact that one party, in this case the United States, had no respect whatsoever for the other party and did not see them as equal partners, basically entitled them to make decisions in their place, to break almost every treaty that's been ever signed, and to impose their way of seeing and being on those lands. So the purpose was not to have and coexist as neighbors. This is tying back to the coexistence of worldviews, as we talked about previously. this is not allowed by that model, because that model is seeking and looking for the homogenization of that land tenure model, right? And so what you found is that these lands would remain collective to a point, because that was the wish of the people at the time, even after they were put in reservations, have been forcibly privatized under a regulation called the Dawes Act. Um, and what it did is that it really not just privatized the land, but the mind of the people as well, to an extent, because it's still a struggle, and there's still resistance to that, because that other worldview that I'm going to talk about in a second is still transpiring. It's still alive, right? It's alive in the Lakota culture, and therefore in the Lakota traditions and way of beings. So that model used to be collective, obviously, in a sense that land, well, it's kind of harder for nomadic population to have a stable land base anyway. So if you look at the original land base of the Lakotas, extended almost across the entire country, um, and all the way into Canada. And I mean, this was a huge land strip that they were using to hunt, to gather, to meet other people, to trade, etc., etc., and were used by other tribes as well. So there was not a stamp on land by the Lakota people. But it was their general livelihoods, and they took care of it accordingly. But that traditional land tenure system relies on a different relationship with nature, which is more embedded, more relational, where other entities are treated equally as equal partners. So the rivers, the mountains, the animals, etc., are all relatives in that system, right? They are treated and considered and seen as relatives. That's why you find that's what you find very, very strongly in storytelling. For instance, in a lot of stories, you find this almost something that looks anthropomorphic from a Western point of view, because they have names, they are thought of and told as having thoughts and feelings, etc. Right? But this is not anthropomorphism in the sense that it's more about recognizing rights and considering and seeing land in a completely different way, and that is a such this is a worldview so different from what we know, because we're so anchored in the separation of man and nature, that it's really hard to grapple um, for Western people, for people who have known only land privatization as a base for life.
Yeah, absolutely. And seeing land just as this inanimate resource from which to extract, right? And if we go back to where this model of land privatization started, my understanding is quite limited, maybe in that, I think about the Middle Ages in England and Europe where people were kicked off the common land. But yeah, what would you say? Was there a sort of turning point where that started to spread?
Yeah, I think that's a fundamental question, actually, because it does start with imposing a way of life which always relies on land, and that way of life was the European model, which was definitely based on land tenure, serfs, and lordships. And so the idea was that you had private property established, and people who were in the service or using land in the service of those realms for in exchange of protection, right? But so as you see in many empires, the starting point of colonization really was about extending resources to feed those populations, right? And also increasing their status and their wealth in order for them to be competitive within that model. So between European countries, right, which were already empires by that point. European countries had completely homogenized the populations that they were on. They had established boundaries which were not the original boundaries, which were already colonial boundaries, which had homogenized people within it. But they all had a common thread, though. So to go back to that particular starting point, I don't really know where the starting point of the land tenure system of the Middle Ages started, but I do know how it was spread and how it caused the same phenomenon happening through colonization. Because what you find is that the common ground for all of these, for all these European systems, was theology. It was a common relation to the Pope, through the Christian faith, the Catholic faith in that particular ways, and then later the Protestants, who were not affiliated with the Pope, but he still carried some of those ideas, and those ideas are fundamental because they form the cultural project behind colonization. You don't go colonize, as neutral individuals, and the idea that somewhat, I mean, very anchored in the American dream, that people left their homes and their families, and they started new lives and new ways in this virgin lands, which was not virgin at all. That it's a myth, and it's a very detrimental and damaging myth, because it completely forgets the impact that those cultural weight have. And obviously that model is reproduced on those bases, right? So you see that, for instance, very, very clearly with a document signed by the Pope in 1493, a year after Columbus. And that document is called the Doctrine of Discovery, referred to today as the Doctrine of Discovery, is a papal bull. So it's an official document signed by the Pope, enabling Christians to seize the property and kill non-Christians in order to establish the realm of God and expand the realm of God. So basically, it justifies colonization in the name of religion, in the name of faith, which was basically a deresponsibilizing, taking away the responsibility from people's shoulder to put it on God, basically. So using God as a scapegoat for for morally justifying taking the land of others. This is literally what the Doctrine of Discovery did. The Doctrine of Discovery, by the way, is still an official document. There are still nowadays some trials that are using it as a legal document upon which to settle land claims in the United States between native tribes and the government. And the Pope is still to revoke that document. It still hasn't. So, if anybody hears and wants to put pressure on that in, that's something that a lot of activists are actively demanding. So things like that you find throughout the place are together concourse towards that land commodification project, and backed up by that colonial project and that theological base
Wow.
underneath it.
So the Pope in the Vatican can still, take back this ancient doctrine and change the way land disputes are handled in the US. It's amazing.
I don't know if they could, I don't know if that act alone would be enough to change all of the laws, the subsequent laws that the US has made after that, because it's a very customary system where the new laws take precedence.
Yeah.
But yeah, you still have that hanging, that very colonial act hanging as a sword over the entire system. So symbolically, it would be a good thing. Symbolically, it means, hey, we made a terrible mistake. It's a good start. It's not remediation or anything like that, but it's a good symbolic start against symbolic violence.
So you've been in the US for a while, you're back in Brittany now, you said, right? And how long were you working in the US for then?
Oh, yes. So I work for this nonprofit called Village Earth, and we came together with native-led organizations in agriculture and land tenure, and we've put together this project called the Native Lands Advocacy Project. So that's officially project I'm working for, Native Lands Advocacy Project, and we put together a website called the Native Land Information System. And the way you access that is by typing nativeland.info. That will take you to a website that has a huge collection of curated data aggregated for reservation lands in the US. And a lot of these data is also contextualized in stories that really help people understand the bigger picture.
Great. So yeah, I was going to ask you actually, do you feel like there is something hopeful and positive happening in the US in terms of recognizing these different, indigenous ways of being with the land, or does it still feel like, you're struggling against this massive dominant paradigm?
Well, first of all, I just want to, remind or bring attention to the fact that this struggle has never ceased, that has never stopped. Indigenous peoples are well and alive in the United States. They're very active in their communities. They're doing whatever they can with the circumstances they've been left with to revive their cultures and their ways of life and their ways of being. And there's just amazing innovation happening right now in on native land everywhere, because people are combining these traditional ways of relating to the earth with different methods and techniques, and they're networking and synchronizing these efforts, etc. And so, although they don't have much capital and they don't have much means, they really managed to co-create beautiful alternatives, and that are not so reliant on markets and not so reliant on fossil fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to look for true alternatives instead of keeping ourselves focused to what white people are doing all the time, it's a great idea to look at what Native people are doing in the US for creating an alternative system and supporting the ecological transition. That's number one. And then I really think that there's a lot of there's a place to have also in the higher spheres in government. And so what Biden has started with kind of increasing the diversity or the visible piece of diversity in the higher spheres of government is a good thing. There's a Secretary of State now who is indigenous herself, and there's a lot of hope that Deb Haaland will really be able to change that picture, because now the Secretary of State basically, who is a Native woman, oversees the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a highly colonial entity, which will supervise a lot of these land oppression processes in the US. So there's hopes in that. That being said, all these figures are still still have to work within a system, and that system is not geared for change, and that system is not geared to support them and their peoples. And so they will have a lot of huge waves to work against. So me and so many other people working in that field are hopeful of those changes. Obviously, that's better than what we had previously, but that doesn't mean that it's going to drastically change everything. I think more hope, emphasis, and visibility needs to be put on local initiatives and what's happening on the ground.
So are you still working with Village Earth now, or has coming back to Brittany got you involved in something else as well?
No, I work in villagers. It's a little challenging sometimes because I literally work in the US, but I'm physically present in Brittany. This is a change that came for personal reasons, but also a need to reconnect with my own land and my own roots. Brittany is a very culturally rich place with a lot of its own dark history to elucidate, and so it's really interesting to be here and important, I think. So I'm starting to be involved in other angles of that worldwide colonial pictures. Particularly, I've joined an observatory in France, which focus on the French colonized territories, some of which are still French regions and counties and whatnot, or administrated by France. So I'm working with some of those people, knowing that all of these organizations can be very localized in their work and in their efforts, but I think a lot of us have really in mind that broader, wider international picture um, that needs to get together and do this work.
Hmm. Yeah, I was wondering if this whole, work you're doing had got you interested in decolonizing in Brittany, because I know I'm Welsh. I've been really interested in going further back into my own history, right? And not just what England brought over, for example. And
Yeah,
yeah.
this is something I've had in mind for quite a bit. Especially in places. So Europe is tricky because Europe is the colonizer, but Europe is itself colonized because this is the perpetration of violence and the perpetration of trauma. And colonial trauma really has this capacity to work that way, where once it colonizes people, these people become colonizers themselves. You can really see that as a historical pattern. So I think the constitution of these national pictures of national identities and national communities, which are illusionary communities, are really have really tried hard to destroy these more regional pictures of European identities, which were multiple and which a lot of them were indigenous originally before they were colonized themselves. And so Wales and Brittany, for instance, are really great pictures. A lot of the people doesn't know, but we have a lot of history in common, a lot of myth in common. Our mythologies actually. Sometimes you have stories that take part half in Brittany and half in Wales, and you don't know where it starts, where it ends. Our language is similar. We also have a lot of Proto-Celtic history and all of these megalith and stones everywhere, and that's kind of part of our. I think a very visual and storytelling cultural base. A lot of people think of Celtic culture as just music, but it's so much more than that. And it used to be, in its pre-colonial times, a highly spiritual society, or societies also based in more relational models integrated within nature, and non-patriarchal models as well. So there's all of these elements that still need to be digged up, and that's a work I'm ready to undertake at some point. Right now I'm still focused on this important work, but yeah, that's definitely something I'm interested in. And I think a lot of hope can come from um, for European people to decolonize themselves, and also American people as well, to really redig that, to desolidarize yourselves with the colonial narrative, and really digging into your own indigenous roots and indigenous histories as a base for that new relational model with nature. I think there's a lot of things to be had with that. Not to be, and it has to come on top of truly decolonizing land elsewhere as well, because otherwise it's just a bypass, and it doesn't shift power dynamics globally. But
So you're saying it's nice to learn your old myths and language, but you need to also really be changing power dynamics on the ground and looking at how we're treating the earth in different communities.
right, because that's what you see, like being, in Celtic roots yourself, you know that very well. Our culture is also being used to, by a lot of, or taken by a lot of right wing, and conservatives and traditionalists and whatnot, who are becoming like that and using this culture as a base to reify white privilege and white superiority. And that's really the antithesis of what you need to do with this. And so the idea is, the reason why they do that is because they're also colonized themselves. And so because they're colonized, they're both, yes, they're both anchored in Celtic culture, but they're also colonized by the white hegemonic mindset. And so that combination is a very, very poor combination. It really exacerbates actually the colonial potential of it. So really what needs to happen is that broader decolonization of the mind where European peoples everywhere need to regain and recollect their own indigenous roots, but in the awareness of their own um, um, background and their active role within their colonizing countries as colonizers. And I think that this is a fundamental shift that needs to happen. So look for your indigenous roots, but in the broader understanding that you're a colonizer and participating to colonizing the world. So to change these dynamics and so
Yeah.
that, yeah.
Yeah, there's also the risk some people use it as a, something connected to narcissism or spiritual bypassing. They just get really excited by, um, oh, I'm descended from druids. Yay, I'm so cool. But they don't think about, yeah, in what ways is my mind colonized, right? In terms of even that sort of focus on the self or wanting to promote your identity to the world, all of these kind of things. So if somebody is completely new to the idea of decolonizing the mind and the land, do you have any resources that you'd recommend as a starting point for somebody?
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of the resources we produce, for instance, are really more geared for U.S. audience and for native users in the U.S. But in terms of decolonizing the mind, there's a lot of exciting resources that have been produced here. And the big one I have in mind here, of course, is a documentary movie produced by a friend of mine who is from the Surinamese diaspora, the Hindustan communities in the Surinamese diaspora. So she's in the Netherlands, and she made this amazing. She's an artist. Her name's Pravini, and that's her artist name as well. And she's made this amazing documentary called "The Uprising." And what it does, it really nicely does the job of connecting all these dots together of the political economy of racism and coloniality with modern activism and the movement, especially that happens for and by all the people of colors in European countries who also come from colonized backgrounds. So it really makes it's a great, I think, especially for a European audience, it's really appropriate. It makes you ask a lot of questions. You need to enter this movie, especially if you don't have a lot of understanding of that, really not on the defensive, which you hear a lot of white people, becoming defensive and uncomfortable talking about white privilege, but that's really a movement that needs to happen, and that discomfort, believe me, is way less uncomfortable than the discomfort of caused by being judged and by people who have taken your land and your ways of life. And so it's something really that needs to be reminded, that a little discomfort talking about white privilege is really not much compared to all the discomfort it has caused to the rest of the world. And so to enter that movie not with prejudices, but with the idea that maybe it has something to teach you. And I think if people enter that movie that way, it can really teach them a lot, because it's very informative, and it interviews people from all types of colonial backgrounds and their points of view, and it's punctuated by songs, because she's an artist, she's a singer, so she also illustrates every chapters so-called of the movie with songs. So The Uprising is if you put The Uprising Pravini as a search, as a keywords in search, you will find that movie for free on YouTube
Wonderful.
and Dailymotion, I
I'll
think.
put a link for it then with this video so people can find it once I.
Yeah, but just because there's another movie called The Uprising, I think that was made in 2013 that has nothing to do with it,
Okay,
so you need
it's
to
not that
put the right link.
Pravini. Okay, you can
Pravini.
send me the link later, maybe. That would be great. Thank you. So, is there anything else that you'd really like to share or to say before we wrap up?
No, not really. I mean, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about these very important issues. I think I would say perhaps that if you're really interested in the ecological transition and how to make the world a better place, a good place to start obviously is with reconnecting with the land, but it shouldn't be apolitical. So it is our responsibility. It is each of us a responsibility to inquire about our own place within the colonial system that we created. And it is really only by decolonizing the world that we will make it regenerative and sustainable for everybody.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I absolutely agree. And I always tell people, growth is always painful, right? So that discomfort you feel when you go into those questions, that's a sign of growth and becoming, I don't know, I think a real responsible adult in the world rather than avoiding what's uncomfortable. So thank you so much for sharing that with me today and for the work that you do.
Thank you.